Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast, authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories, but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Podcasts share their career-defining drug, song and book, and also share their joyful patient stories. Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. So, we were chatting about how might the Three Apothecaries contribute to World Antimicrobial Awareness Week and to European Antibiotic Awareness Day. And so here you are. It's an antimicrobial special. No better way to contribute to such an important issue than with a podcast mini-series that welcomes great guests from the world of medicines and healthcare and gets downloaded across the globe. Thank you for all your support. And so for this special, our guest is Phil Howard. Phil is the Antimicrobial Stewardship Lead for the North-East and Yorkshire region of England. He's also former president of the British Society of Antimicrobial Chemotherapy. We will welcome Phil in a moment as he shares a drug for the Oral Apothecary Formulary, his career anthem, and recommends a book for our library. Our micro discussion this week is right on message 2 as we look at sore throat test and treat service provided by community pharmacies. Before any of that, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. It's been a while. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff. Welcome both.
Evening.
Evening.
You say it's been a while, but oh my God, what's been going on since we've been off the air? I'd really like to use the new Collins Dictionary Word of the Year. I'm sure you all know what that is, don't you?
Remind us.
We've been in the middle of a perma-crisis. I really like to call it a shit show, to be honest, with all the stuff that's been going on with the political instability. So, yeah, there's a lot been going on while we've not been here. And Trussonomics obviously got us into a major problem. But I think I'm allowed to say this, but maybe one of the good things about the recent change in government is maybe we'll have a Secretary of State for Health and Social Care who doesn't suggest that it's a good idea to lend out antibiotics to their friends for coughs and sore throats. But anyway, I'll move on from that. The other thing that I wanted to say was, after Jamie, you talked to us about the law of triviality and Parkinson's law in the last episode, I came across another great law via a group that I'm on, and it was called Brandolini's Law. Does anyone know what that is?
Nope.
Also called the bullshit asymmetry principle. And the adage is that the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it. And so I thought that was a great law that we should tell our listeners about.
I have read a paper on pseudo-profound bullshit.
Right, okay.
And so I'll dig that out. I'll dig that out for you.
Yeah, I was just going to say I've seen that one.
Anyway, I thought that was great. Brandolini's Law.
Gimmo, what you been up to?
Well, I had that in my intro, Steve. Queen sadly passed away and 2 prime ministers since we last met, and I think it was only about a month ago, wasn't it? So, it's been a busy time. Well, one thing I've done recently is I went on an effective writing course, a professional writing course. It was actually ran by Olivia Timms, who used to be the editor of the Pharmaceutical Journal. A few nuggets. She emphasised the need for a clear message. What are you trying to achieve with your writing? Get it down in a sentence of about 12 words and include a verb. This was really interesting. Beware the false feedback loop. The people who comment on your documents are rarely your target audience. So choose who you ask for feedback very carefully. Be specific in what feedback that you're asking for and interpret their comments with care. And I thought that was really good because you think about who often sends you comments on documents and what they say. And then the final phrase, piano, put it across, not out. So yeah, if you ever get the chance to do that course, Olivia, I recommend it.
Well, can I recommend another course? It's the
Is
same.
it one of yours?
Is it your course, Jamie?
It's the same course with me, Gimmo.
You run it, do you?
I do. Olivia is one of the Tim Albert trainers. And so
there
I'm
we
also
go.
one of those trainers.
It's not just thrown together, is it?
I tell you what, though, that's dead right about who you ask to give comments on, because it's actually okay to disagree, isn't it? When somebody gives you a comment, it's like it is your work and it is okay to disagree with it.
No, so when you ask somebody for any comments, the only way they can fail with that task is if they don't give you any.
Yes.
And so that's when they're searching for minutiae, or they give you little bits that. So the question you ask of your reviewers and there's different people, isn't it? You may ask your spouse or your partner for readability.
Yeah.
Then you ask your technical help, and yep, great course, and hats off to Tim as well. If he's perhaps he's listening somewhere in Kent.
Oh, that reminds me. I've got a trainee pharmacist again at the minute that always give me new impetus, and I was telling them about the audit that they're writing, and I said, listen, when you finished it, you should be able to give it to your mother and father, no matter what they do, and they should be able to read it and understand it.
Very good.
What about you, Jamie? What have you been up to?
Revalidation submitted, sorted.
What? Oh my
Oh,
God!
yeah, got mine in.
I forgot.
I've been on the wards for some more CPD, which is always interesting.
Oh, blimey.
Yeah. And I've got the habit of parkrun back. And so coffee and chat with parkrun chums is a real energizer too. So,
Well, we've mentioned coffee twice. We've only been on for 5 minutes.
Okay, look, it's that time of year when people take a closer interest in the ABs. For many, that means that the All Blacks, the New Zealand rugby team, have arrived in the UK, and for others, it's the annual refocus on antibiotic awareness. Let's welcome our guest, Phil Howard, the Oral Apothecary. Phil has an extensive bio available in the show notes. Quickly, look, he's a member of various Department of Health stewardship and advisory groups looking at antimicrobial resistance and healthcare-acquired infections. His research interests include antimicrobial stewardship and antibiotic shortages. He's got lots of awards. He's a fellow of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, and he was awarded an OBE a few years ago. Welcome, Phil. What have you been up to?
Thank you so much for having me. Well, this is the busiest time of year for me. Work like hell in November, most of October, holiday for the rest of the time, it seems like, to the rest of you. So, what's on my agenda? So, World Antibiotic Awareness Week, as you've said, is the 18th to the 25th of November. So, this is when we infectionists in the world get together and try and tell the rest of the world about antimicrobial resistance. Unless you start doing something about it, modern medicine, as you know, will stop. So that's one of our main focuses.
Can you repeat that? That last sentence is quite important, isn't it? Go on, repeat that last sentence for us, Phil.
Yeah, so joking aside, antimicrobial resistance is a major issue. It will stop modern medicine as we know it. We'll go back to prior to the invention of penicillin. We're already seeing warnings where resistance is so high in Italy, Romania, Greece, that it's probably starting to get dangerous to do transplantation, give chemotherapy, major surgery and things like that. India, they're already having those major problems out there. Bugs fly around the world, so it's a problem for everyone. So we really need to try and focus on it, and everybody can do their bit, whether you're a member of the public, healthcare professional. It's really important for everybody. And this is why we try and focus during this week on telling everyone how you can help.
Very good. So should we bring in at this point, look, STC and yourself have been hatching something as well, haven't you? What have you got planned? It's not just thrown together, STC. What are we doing?
Yeah, so some people quite like this podcast, it seems. So we were approached by somebody, i.e. Phil, who said, although he wasn't an early adopter, he was a bit of a laggard, to be honest, in relation to the Oral Apothecary. But fair play to him. He did, after the CPC, say, I've got to start listening. And then he listened to it back to back, pretty much, I think, while he was training for some rowing thing. Anyway, he said, look, I think this is a really good way to get educational messages out. He'd put to BSAC that a podcast was a really good way of doing education, and obviously our CPD in a pub. So he approached us and we said, yeah, we'd be happy to do that. So the plan hopefully is that if Phil's any good today, that is, that Phil will actually become the fourth apothecary, and then we'll do a little mini series all to do with antimicrobial stewardship. And there will be different members from BSAC, different health professionals, and they will come on as guests. And that's the plan. Isn't that right, Phil?
It certainly is. It's something that everybody loves.
What, a podcast?
A podcast, a drug, and a book.
Phil, you might have seen earlier in the week that Steve got into a bit of trouble for using abbreviations on one of our WhatsApp groups. And so BSAC, just to remind our listener again.
Yeah, it stands for the British Society of Antimicrobial Chemotherapy.
And we should say at this point, I mean, Phil's not the sort of person, I've known Phil a long time, he's not the sort of person to blow his own trumpet, but I think I'm right in saying this, Phil, that you were the president of BSAC, weren't you? And you were the first pharmacist to be president, is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
So big up to you. I know it's not a pharmacy podcast, but I think we should realise that we are talking about somebody who's been in this world for a long, long time and has got a lot of knowledge and experience, and is able to influence people, because I think at those levels you have to be an influencer, don't you?
Yeah. So whilst BSAC is British in name, it's global in nature. So there's an awful lot of the work that we do around the world trying to get better use of antibiotics. BSAC does education and training in multiple languages provides courses. We do train the trainer. So all the big challenging economies are coming out. Brazil, Russia, India, China. We also do things in Spanish. We've done lots of work in the Middle Eastern countries, Africa. So we're really doing our bit to really try and spread the message, work with local key opinion leaders and help spread the word as much as possible.
In terms of Antimicrobial Awareness Week, are there some key messages this year? Are there some sort of key themes that you're focusing on?
Yeah, so nationally, it's building on really what we had from last year. We know COVID's been a massive issue, still an issue for lots of people. So instead of trying to stretch busy people, we're trying to provide as many things as possible for people to use. We have a series of webinars coming across over the week that people can tune into. There's a toolkit with lots of resources that are available that people can pick up and use to either engage with other healthcare professionals or the general public. If you light buildings up already, we're suggesting you may light them up in blue, but please don't use any extra electricity if you don't light them up already. We'll talk about AMR sustainability a little later, hopefully. So there are lots of things that we're pulling together for people to try and use, depending on the amount of time they have available. But every year it amazes me the ingenuity that comes from people across the UK and beyond.
I've got one for you, Phil, from last year's campaign. It was featured in the Pharmaceutical Journal. Pharmacy receives nearly 500 packs of medicines back during antibiotic amnesty. Did you see that one? So that was on the back of last year's Awareness Week. An antibiotic amnesty in community pharmacies in the Midlands, recording almost 8,000 conversations on the Pharma Outcomes platform, 369 partially used packs of antibiotics back, and 126 unused full packs back.
That's not Theresa Coffey's constituency then.
Yeah, so that was fabulous. And so I must thank the former health secretary for the comments she made, because actually she provided a platform for discussion to take place. And so the Royal Pharmaceutical Society has set up an antibiotic amnesty, how to set up your own campaign, built around what they did in the Midlands. And certainly a number of regions are picking it up. My patch in West Yorkshire, they're going to do it. And so it's a really important way of getting the public to realise that they should be returning unwanted antibiotics. And certainly some of the research that I've done with undergraduates with the University of Huddersfield has shown that younger people tend to share their leftover antibiotics with friends. Older people save them for the next time. Others throw them around the bin, and they're really not aware of the dangers of doing that. And when we've done some studies before and actually educated people, they've changed their behaviours. And so we've got some real sort of issues. So hopefully the RPS campaign will really take off.
And so we don't want any flush down the toilets either.
No, certainly not. So that's a real other big issue, is that we'll often have read about sort of problems when we have flooding, in that our sewage system can't cope with what's available there. And we end up with lots of resistant bacteria from people who are taking antibiotics in the water. And so there are big issues on there. And certainly there's lots of focus around that at the moment. And this latest UK National Action Plan for Antimicrobial Resistance has partly picked up on the environment as being a real issue. And it's quite frightening, the amount of resistant bugs that come out of hospital wastewater. So there's lots of research going on around that.
Yeah, Phil, I'll tell you a couple of things. You know how I love a podcast, as you know. And so I listened to 2 podcasts in preparation for tonight. And they were both from one of the Free Economics Radio I listened to a lot. And one was by somebody called Cassandra Quave, who was on People I Mostly Admire, episode 60. And she is an ethnobotanist, and she talks about how we need to find, new new antibiotics, if you like, by looking for the plants, etc. And it was fascinating. If you've got a scientific mind, I would suggest that you listen, because she's a scientist, but she's also spent a lot of time in the Amazon rainforest and things like that. And what's really fascinating is that she nearly died when she was young after getting a Staph aureus infection after she had to have her leg amputated. So it's a really, really good one. And then the second one is Freakonomics MD, which is a guy who's he's a physician but also an economist. And he had one on very recently called Doctors Know They Prescribe Too Many Antibiotics, Don't They? Why Don't They Stop? And they had a guy on called Dr. Jeff Linder. And obviously I'd heard some of this, but he basically, in a nutshell, said there were 3 ways he thought the evidence was best to reduce antibiotic use by prescribers. Was 1, some kind of pre-commitment poster, like in your waiting room saying, I'm Dr. Smith and I'm trying my best not to prescribe antibiotics, so that the patient knows when they go in there that their doctor is doing their bit. The second one was what he called accountable justifications, where they have to say why they've decided to use something that isn't what's considered to be a nice narrow spectrum antibiotic. And the third one, which I've always been a fan of, and that's peer comparison. So the idea that you know where you are in comparison with everybody else in relation to antibiotic prescribing. So I wondered if you had a view. It's quite a big question, but that's what I wanted to ask you about.
Get used to that, Phil.
Yeah, so certainly most of those things have been tried already. So quite a few years ago, Dame Sally Davis wrote, when she was Chief Medical Officer, to all of the high prescribing practices, which had a very short effect on reducing their antibiotic prescribing. People have run campaigns before of actually having GPs and other staff sign a poster in their room describing their commitment to prescribing appropriately. We've seen the Keep Antibiotic Working campaign that ran those little almost annoying dancing antibiotic capsules which were on television for quite a bit of time. And that actually had a major impact on GPs. 94% said they felt empowered to be able to say no to patients asking for antibiotics. And it was somewhere in the high 80s where patients claimed they wouldn't ask their GP for an antibiotic after that. In terms of the justification, we were trying hard to get people to have better coding of their prescribing and GP practices to try and understand how they are using antibiotics, because we're doing an awful lot on data linkage at the moment. So finally, we're getting some of the join up around hospital admissions and the reason, and there will be some data coming in from EPAC2, so from primary care prescribing, that will allow us to look at deprivation, ethnicity, and areas like that to really understand what's driving some of the prescribing. But I think a lot of people, if they don't really want to follow a guideline, they can be quite vague about what they put in some of the medical notes on that. And then the final thing about peer comparisons is there's stacks of data out there already. One of the projects that is running out of the University of Leeds and Bradford has been the LAMP project, which is lowering antimicrobial prescribing, which is giving specific feedback as you describe, but actually with key messages around resistance in key syndromic infections such as UTIs. And that really is giving good results, and it's been rolled out certainly within the North-Eastern Yorkshire. So all of those things do work. They work really well.
But it's a behaviour, isn't it? It's the behaviour change that, and we talk a lot on this podcast. People do know that, the clinicians know, and it's the social pressure of the patients. It's almost the same as, I don't know, where patients choose to continue to take proton pump inhibitors for their indigestion and reflux. They could choose to change their lifestyle and not have to take the drugs.
Yeah, there's 2 bits. There's one about people believe patients ask for antibiotics. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think doctors and other non-medical prescribers believe that patients want antibiotics. And one of the really key bits is actually asking patients what they expect from the consultation up front to really get to understand their expectations. And the UCSA, so UK Health Security Agency Primary Care Unit, run a really good toolkit called Target Antimicrobial Resistance Guidelines, Education and Training. It's hosted on the Royal College of General Practitioners site. And in there has got lots of tools around how to run a consultation with a patient, loads of things around information. And the information is staggering. 26 different languages, patient information leaflets come in now, and pictorial versions on there. So there's lots of information out there, and we're just about to start as the antibiotic prescribing team within NHS England to support UXA of rolling this out again in almost the post-COVID era, to really refresh everybody to get more of a focus again.
And I'm guessing one of the things that drives prescribing is, I mean, we talked a few episodes back about safety netting, and I guess from a prescriber's point of view, there's an element of prescribing as a safety net. And I don't know if there's anything specifically we can do it in terms of providing the evidence and the chances of things happening. Has that really been looked at, that mindset in the prescribers of prescribing as a safety issue?
Yeah, totally. So the target information sources that I spoke about earlier, within them, apart from telling the patient what type of infection they've got, how long it will last, what they can do for self-care, it contains a whole section on safety netting, on who to contact if you start to develop any of these symptoms. And they're specific for UTIs, respiratory, there's one for cellulitis coming, and there's a general one on there. So the safety netting is built into all of this. And I think this is a really important element of any of the consultations that take place, which is, we won't give you an antibiotic because I think it's probably viral at the moment, but I'll give you this information. If you develop any of these things, it will tell you who to contact and where to go and in what sort of time scale. So if they think you're developing sepsis, then you should go somewhere more urgently. Or if it's less severe symptoms coming on, you can either ring NHS 111, see your community pharmacist, or make an appointment back at the practice again. So I think there is some great stuff coming through there. And as we've rolled out News 2, so the National Early Warning Scoring System, certainly within England, it's about getting everyone speaking the same language to see who are the potential at-risk patients in there. So I think there is some bits going through. Certainly could be a lot more. I think there's certainly been some research of newspaper headlines comparing sepsis stories against antimicrobial resistance. It's a ratio of 3-1 in favour of sepsis. And the sepsis stories, whilst very sad, are often individual patient based rather than looking at the larger impact.
I think that's it. But I think often when you talk to a GP who's, I can remember this on experience, who's prescribed it is often driven by a sepsis type experience, isn't it? And so their perception of risk might be skewed by that individual experience.
Well, do you remember when we had Diane on, we talked about this, and it's that great paper. Do you remember that editorial we looked at, which was Diagnostic Uncertainty? And that was exactly what you're talking about. But I think I'm right in saying, Phil, that also there is evidence, isn't there, that giving a delayed antibiotic prescription has also been shown to reduce overall antibiotic usage. I understand. That's my understanding.
Yes, there is. There's quite a bit of evidence. Things have changed more recently. Previously, when we used to have paper-based prescriptions, you could ask the patient to come back if they weren't feeling well to collect it. And you found probably around about 60% never returned for the prescription. It was about 40% if you actually gave them the prescription and you cashed it in. Since we've moved to electronic transfer of prescriptions, so they go up onto the spine and be pulled down by a pharmacy, there's some data that's been done once part of the national Ipsos Mori polls, where they claim only 6% of patients who were actually interviewed actually ended up taking their just-in-case backup antibiotics. So it's potentially quite small.
The Oral Apothecary is sponsored by Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching and OneLessPill.com.
Okay, well, I think we've had some great chat already. I know we're going to come back to this in our micro discussion, but one of the pleasures, Phil, of being, I don't know, can we induct you as a fourth apothecary?
Not
I don't
yet,
know, but
not
anyway.
Yet. He's still a guest.
Okay, so as a guest, as you will well know, one of the pleasures is to give us three things for the Oral Apothecary. So the first one is, I'm going to call it out as it is, it's a desert island drug. What are you going to give us?
So my desert island drug is going to be ciprofloxacin, because it has been central to so many elements of my career. And whilst this is a podcast and I sound like a younger man, I'm actually have been a qualified pharmacist for 36 years. When I first qualified and started practicing in the late 80s, I was a junior pharmacist and I went up onto a ward. Ciprofloxacin just been launched, and I challenged the registrar to say, you can't have ciprofloxacin. It's a new restricted antibiotic. You've got to get permission. And he said to me, it's the only drug that will cover the bugs in my patient. And I had no idea at the time what Cipro covered, as it had just been launched. So I went down to the pharmacy department with my tail between my legs and asked a senior pharmacist on how I could learn the spectrums of cover. And she'd said to me, you can't. You're just going to have to learn them. So I made a system up, and I've been teaching this system of how to learn the spectrums to students for probably 30 odd years now. In fact, I only did it yesterday, on Wednesday, when I was teaching at the University of Bradford on the system. And I still come across even GPs, qualified everything, who did pharmacy and then things, they go, I've still got the little handout that I keep in my pocket to remember. The other reason is Cipro's on my list is it was a game changer antibiotic. It was an oral antibiotic, great bioavailability, had Pseudomonas cover. It was one of the first antibiotics that we had there, and it still is a great antibiotic. It's only later that did we learn about the harms related to the use of ciprofloxacin, and that became another focus of my role. So I look after patient safety and pharmacogenomics within my current role for the national team. And I'm also involved in a lot of work around trying to remove inaccurate penicillin allergy labels. And a lot of these patients end up getting ciprofloxacin as an alternative. And penicillin allergy labels basically are bad for your health. There's been recent evidence.
We've talked about them on the podcast before. Yep.
Excellent. So I will be launching at the tail end of World Antibiotic Awareness Week an evidence bundle on penicillin allergy delabeling. So watch out.
Yes.
It'll be coming your way.
Excellent. Oh, we love that. Okay, so ciprofloxacin.
Can I jump in with a Cipro quick story, because it's related to parkrun?
Yeah, go for it.
So I said my parkrun chats are back because I've been back into parkrun. When I first started parkrun, probably about 3-4 years ago, we were having coffee, and one of my parkrun chums pointed at somebody and said, "Oh, see that guy over there? He used to be a triathlete, and he used to be Iron Man, the works." And then something happened. He said he had a UTI or something, and now he can't run. And I subsequently found he'd had Cipro for a UTI many years ago, and he had tendon rupture.
Achilles tendon
and
rupture.
So I don't know anything else about it, but you just look at it and think, well, oh my. So if Cipro wasn't appropriate for his UTI,
which it probably wasn't.
Yeah, probably wasn't, but we don't know.
Unless he was self-catheterizing.
Yeah, we don't know. We don't know, but very unlikely. Then look, the impact on his life is huge.
It's a major problem. We have a massive gap with a lack of good gram-negative oral antibiotics, and it's something that we need to try and sort of fill.
Phil Howard.
Yeah, maybe Phil Howard. But what I didn't mention before is, so we're doing a whole load of work nationally, a subscription model for paying for antibiotics in a different way. And certainly there are two that have been launched for carbapenem-resistant gram-negatives. But actually, on my list is we need something better to replace ciprofloxacin and other fluoroquinolones, which, whilst they're brilliant drugs and fill lots of gaps, they come with all these harms that we need to find a replacement which doesn't cause harm.
I also remember when I used to work for Jonathan Cook, who, as you will well know, has been very much involved in the antimicrobial resistance story since the beginning, probably. And he used to call me into his office every now and then and say, "See, look at this." And he would show me the graph of how bad the resistance to ciprofloxacin was getting, year on year on year. And it was a real massive problem, isn't it, in relation to resistance. classically because it was got overused, because it killed so many things according to your label of which organisms it covers, and therefore everyone was using Domestos when they could just be using a bit of soap and water.
Yeah, you're entirely true, and that's why the two drugs approved by NICE, cefiderocol, which is the modern day super Domestos, and ceftazidime avibactam, are quite carefully controlled. They have to be used within certain guidelines for certain resistant mechanisms. And one of my weekly jobs is monitoring the use of those via these blue tech forms. And we're getting some really valuable data coming out, which will help monitor this. And if you think you're spending up to £20 million a year on two drugs, whether you use them or not, you want to make sure you're getting almost your best value for money. But actually, we're using these drugs that cause less harm than the existing drugs. And for me, curing our patients of infections is really important, but actually not causing them harm. And this is what antimicrobial stewardship is. Best outcome, no harm, not increasing resistance.
Okay, excellent. Well, you can definitely have ciprofloxacin. That's in the Oral Apothecary Formulary. Okay, next up is the career anthem for the Oral Apothecary Spotify playlist. What are you going to give us?
Well, I'm going to give you something from the Pink Floyd Wish You Were Here album.
Ooh.
It is a full 13 minutes long of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, parts 1 to 5, written as a tribute and remembrance to Pink Floyd founding member Syd Barrett, who left the band, unfortunately, because of probably illegal drug-induced mental
Psychosis.
health issues. And it was always going to be, and probably still is, going to be one of my funeral songs. Might be the first time you've ever had a funeral song on. And the reason
all 13 minutes.
Yeah, all 13 minutes.
Oh my God, you'll have to pay for 3 cremation times if you want a 13-minute funeral song.
And like my career, it starts off slowly with Rick Wright playing this G chord in his synthesizer, and then Dave Gilmour bringing that haunting guitar break in with those repeating 4 notes, or known as the Sid's theme. And then the song grows, and I think it's been a bit like my career. And one of the anecdotes that I've got for you is that my pre-reg tutor, who's sadly died now, wrote on my sign-off forms when I was doing my extra 6 months of pre-regdom, was his enthusiasm will be tempered by experience. It hasn't, and it never will be. So that's why I've chosen Shine On You Crazy Diamond, probably reflects my career, by Pink Floyd.
It doesn't end abruptly, though, does it?
It might do.
I'm going to play that tonight. I love a bit of Pink Floyd.
Yeah, so those of you who might have listened to the beginning know that both Jamie's and ours songs in the Oral Apothecary Spotify playlist. And remember, if you're a new listener to this, if you go onto Spotify, you will actually find the Oral Apothecary Spotify playlist of all the guests who've been on recorded shows and live shows. We have had a Pink Floyd track before, but not that one. But the reason I'm telling you this is the 2 tracks that Jamie and I picked were both picked for the same reason, and that we both used to play them when we were doing our graduation, when we were doing our degree examinations. It was our turn in the shower. We shared a house, and you could have your track. So there was me, there was Jamie, and then there was another pharmacist called Darren Cooper. And guess what his track was? Shine On You Crazy Diamond.
He wanted a long shower.
He did want a long shower. He got a lot of stuff done in the shower when he was there, I tell you. Or in the shower room, anyway. Right, so excellent. You can have that. And the third thing is for the Oral Apothecary Library. What book would you like to recommend to the listener?
This was a really difficult one. I routinely have one book on my desk, which I look at on a regular basis, called Storytelling with Data by Cole Nussbaumer Knaflic. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She's done loads of stuff for Google and everything else, which is about putting messages over in data clearly. Brilliant book, but it's not going to be that one. The book, which I have in front of me, signed by the author, is The Drugs Don't Work, A Global Threat by Professor Dame Sally C. Davies. And it's a Penguin special. It's a deliberately slim book, got less than 100 pages in, so it should be good for all the readers to whiz through on an evening. And it tries to get over a single point with devastating effect. And it starts off with a little story of life in 2043, when all the antibiotics have failed. And what appears to be a harmless throat infection could result in isolation and death. And I've used the story about Mrs. Wu, who develops this throat infection, and the family tried to hide her in the house, though she can get better before the authorities come and quarantine the whole house, and then send them to a sanatorium to die because there are no effective antibiotics on there. And then it goes through the history of antibiotics and some of the challenges and the various nasties that we have to face up to. And I've used this story at the beginning, lots of different talks, to really try to paint a picture for students or anyone willing to listen to me about what antimicrobial resistance could be like. And the good news is the royalties from this book actually go to promote antimicrobial stewardship education around the world. I think that is good value for money. £3.99 from all good bookstores.
It's a good book, really good book. I did a piece of work once with another sort of antimicrobial stewardship legend, Avril Tucker, who you may have heard of. Or...
I sit on various nice committees with her.
Yeah, and so to say thank you, she bought me a book. It was a graphic novel called Surgeon X. I don't know if you've read it, but it was a similar concept. It was a graphic novel, but it was set in a dystopian future where your access to antibiotics was sort of based on your social standing, and so it created a society that revolved around access to antibiotics that worked. And so similar sort of dystopian type future picture to what you described. So I'd recommend that as well.
But, just to come back on that, on a slightly more serious note, is that probably exists already, around whether you're a high-income country or a low or middle-income country. You'll be amazed about how few drugs are actually licensed in all countries around the world. The newer, really good drugs that are needed in the world are probably only available in, say, 10 countries at a time, and it's a major problem. So that exists already, and some of the current bits that we're working across the globe is really how we make the countries who need these newer antibiotics against resistance bugs able to get them. So it's a really important piece of work. But I will read Surgeon X. I made a note earlier.
Very good. Okay, so there you go. The Drugs Don't Work, a Global Threat by Professor Dame Sally Davis. Excellent. Great picks there, Phil, and all really in keeping with the whole theme of antibiotic awareness. So, Gimmo, I think you're going to introduce this micro discussion, aren't you?
Yeah, so we've mentioned a couple of times the Trays of Coffee comments about sharing antibiotics with friends and family. Well, that came on the back of reports of plans to allow pharmacies to prescribe antibiotics without patients being seen first by their GP. And so anyone who followed this on Twitter will have seen some measured comments and some hysterical comments about the risks of antibiotics being handed out more freely, contributing to an increase in antimicrobial resistance. Well, here in Wales, such a service already exists. It's an NHS-funded sore throat test and treat service provided from select community pharmacies across the country. And so our paper today is an evaluation of that service. The service uses a clinical scoring system. I think it's Centaur, which many of you will be familiar with, alongside rapid antigen testing to support a decision or not to supply penicillin when the patient presents with a sore throat. So we can discuss the main findings in detail, but I think the one that's relevant to the Trays of Coffee discussion is that the overall antibiotic supply was about 21% of patients presenting with a sore throat, compared to the GP rates of between 35 and 83%. So, Phil, wondered what you thought.
Yeah, so I was rejoiced when this paper came out because I was involved in the original pilot service evaluation of the sore throat test and treat in a large community pharmacy chain. I won't say who. And I was also part of the NICE guideline committee that looked at this and considered it. And I tried hard to get some research funded as a randomized controlled trial to explore this in community pharmacy. And I was unsuccessful with this team for an NIHR HTA grant to look at it. So I was over the moon when this came out. This is a really important paper. So interestingly, I hadn't realised the numbers were so big, but they talk about that 10% of patients see a GP each year for a sore throat. I was staggered when I read that in the paper, and that 8% of acute prescribing in general practice is for sore throats. So this is a really important paper. So I must admit, in terms of looking at those numbers, I would say read the paper really carefully. So one of the things that they did do is only prescribe antibiotics in 21% of the cases. However, if you end up looking carefully at some of the details, 43% of the antibiotics that were supplied were for a moderate score of 2 to 3 with fever pain. But if you read the NICE guidance, they recommend for that score either no antibiotic or a backup antibiotic. So there could be a lower threshold for testing. And interestingly, only 1% of the patients who had a positive test chose to self-care. And if you looked at the NICE guidance, you would have thought that may have been higher rather than accepting the antibiotics. So there could be a slight counter-argument that this might actually have an effect on driving up some of the antibiotics. However, for me, I think this is a really important paper because what it does is we know that there is pressure on GP practice. We know in some areas there are really low levels of GPs. They struggle often with the acute work that's coming in at the moment. And I think what this paper does, whilst it's not a randomized controlled trial of pharmacy versus GPs, it's not a health economic evaluation. It didn't look at the impact of primary care, and it didn't give us any information on reconsultation rates. What it did do is actually add to the evidence base to support the role of community pharmacy that can relieve pressure off GPs. And I think it does show that it probably does reduce the burden of antibiotic dispensing. And I think it will be interesting to see what NICE think about this when they see the evidence that's come through. And this research group have published repeatedly on this database. And of course, patients love it. It's immediate access. The other bit on here is that 50% of the patients were referred by their GP, but when they did speak to the patients, nearly all of them said they would have gone to their GP or A&E, thus putting more pressure onto the system. So I think this is a really important paper, and I'm hoping that it might be considered as a model for adoption elsewhere.
So guys, is it still running in Wales as we speak? Is this service still running?
As I understand it, because this is a midpoint review, isn't it? So I think it's there's more to come.
Yeah, I think they suspended it or certainly changed it during COVID on there. But certainly the Andrew Evans, the chief pharmacist for Wales, is really visionary, I think, in the whole way they're approaching infections in Wales. In England, of course, there'd been a temporary pause on rolling out new schemes for the use of patient group directions with antibiotics, whilst everyone updated their existing PGDs to make sure they had good safety netting involved, which you spoke around earlier. They matched current recommendations from NICE and elsewhere. And I think the bit which I'm hoping this will possibly get extrapolated to, it will need very careful analysis, is the pharmacists are actually using NICE guidelines. And I think if you go to other countries within the UK, that's not always the case. I don't think community pharmacies regularly use fever pain to assess sore throat across the board. And I think this is the first step forward of having a standard approach for, irrespective of who you go and see as a healthcare profession, using the same assessment criteria, which is really important.
Can I just say, so my reflection is, as you've said, what a great opportunity for community pharmacists to be working as a health professional on the high street. And let's think about it. This is about access, like you've just said. So whilst I understand that at the minute, both England and Scotland have said it's not cost effective, as far as I can see from what I've read, it is about access. And it is, one of those things that think about emergency hormonal contraception when that first became available in community pharmacies, and there was uproar in some quarters, but it's about patient choice and it's about patient access. And in the same way with emergency hormonal contraception, you should be getting the same standard of service whether you're seeing a nurse, a pharmacist or a doctor. If they're appropriately trained and they're using the appropriate system, the guidance as to whether it's this score and that score, and if this can help to give confidence about what it is that pharmacists can do, I don't really understand why we wouldn't be using this for that matter. And I suppose the question is, and I don't know if you know, although it sounds like you sat on the NICE guidance, is that, to meet the cost effectiveness, as we know, NICE is always looking at cost effectiveness. But as I understand it, NICE itself doesn't have an economic assessment for antimicrobial resistance itself. And therefore, it's quite difficult to almost say whether this is cost effective because it's not considering what is cost effective for antimicrobial resistance. Is that true?
Historically, they've not looked at health economics when they've been doing common infections. The exception had been in the most recent Clostridium difficile guidelines. That's the first time when we've actually had cost effectiveness brought in. It does exist in health technology assessments, but not as part of the common frameworks coming in. As part of the NICE new models of antimicrobial funding, they have tried to model the value of antibiotics in there. And by looking at, you have to always look at the published literature, but then they will look at these other values. They're called these steady insurance values, which is really around the spectrum of the antibiotic, transmission, enablement to do other operations, diversity, so mixing up the antibiotics used, and insurance value, so if everything goes wrong. So there is some early work going on there. I am aware that Wales have reviewed the technology and actually says it does meet the criteria of being under the £20,000 per quality on there. So that would be quite interesting, which I was unaware of that before I read the paper.
Quality adjusted life year for anybody listening. That's what QALY stands for. That's what NICE is interested in, whether or not it's good value for money.
So Health Technology Wales have produced a review on it, haven't they? And they announced the 100% certainty of being below the £20,000 quality.
Oh, was this a recent one? Because I thought I'd looked and there was one from like last year or the year before from Wales, and it still didn't say it made it. But anyway, that's good news.
I rang Effie yesterday, the lead author. And so Effie Matsurani, prolific, as Phil said, with her and the team, supported by Andrew Evans, Chief Pharmaceutical Officer. And again, they've got some great papers in this area. So I rang her yesterday. Look, she took my call. She was in the snow dome. She wasn't skiing herself, but she was in the snow dome. And I just said, "Oh, what's your gut feel then, Effie, for all the work that you've done?" And so she went through a few things that are fascinating. She said it's about how people follow protocols, so different professional groups and they're following protocols, involving all the stakeholders, evidence-based training, she said, so important, not we'll give this a go type training, or we'll give this a go type attitude, because the two words that jumped out at me in the paper were scalable. You can see the scale of this. Not many things we do are instantly scalable, are they? And then confidence was the other word that jumped out to me. And there's confidence for the healthcare professional, confidence for the community pharmacist in this case, and the clinicians then in primary care. But also you could see the confidence that came from the patients using the service as well. I had a nice little catch-up with Effie yesterday. She was delighted that her paper was featuring as our micro discussion. She said
not just thrown together.
No, she said that there are European partners that she's in discussion with. As well as NHS England, I think prior to COVID in particular, they've been down and had a look. And then she finished off with one really important one for me. She said, "Don't forget, Jamie," she said, "the ultimate goal is that the patients don't need to go to see the pharmacist either for lots of these self-limiting." And so that was a real, I thought, yeah, that's it, isn't it? So this is a step, she said. This is a step in terms of moving some of the workload and the demand away from our busy GP colleagues. But actually, a lot of these patients don't actually need to come and see any healthcare professional, potentially. They could manage it themselves.
So, I mean, it'd be hard to track, but is that going to be part of her... Sorry, Phil, is that going to be part of her research, I wonder?
I'll tell you one thing's for certain, though. What we're talking about here about community pharmacists and giving out antibiotics is quite different to what I think happens in lots of other countries in the world, where apparently you can buy antibiotics quite easily.
Well, Mexico, buy one, get one free, the Cipro.
Yeah, it does vary, and I think this has been some of the concern in that the message that is given out, and this is why anything that involves expanding the community pharmacy as a different avenue for patients receiving appropriate antibiotics has to be very clearly within a framework, as we've said already, that has the same level of care that you would get if you saw a general practitioner, or improves what happens, doesn't drive up the antibiotic consumption, and is really clear in those messages that it doesn't reflect that we hear from some other countries. Lots of countries in Europe are really cracking down hard upon this. And it's a big challenge, and certainly some of the work that we've been doing with the International Federation of Pharmacy, FIP, has been around this. And one of the bits I would like to highlight around some of these things, around the prescriptions, is this antibiotic prescription checklist, which you may have come across as part of the English Pharmacy Quality Scheme, where the pharmacist actively asks the patient what the antibiotic's for, understands the information needs, where they've got problems with kidneys, liver, breastfeeding, pregnant, etc., then checks against the guidelines. And it's really been community pharmacy fully into antimicrobial stewardship, from the self-care, the minor infections, but also when it comes to prescribing on there. And we should really celebrate the work that's been done. So partly Diana Shorodopi and the primary care unit in UXA and I, and it started off as a pre-reg project in Huddersfield about 7 years ago, and it has now been adopted as a global tool. So we will see this rolling out across the world, that hopefully will get all pharmacists, whatever country they're on, starting to be much better stewards than we've seen historically.
Very good. Look, final name check first. So it's Dr. Effie Mansurani from Cardiff School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. So anybody interested, go and see their suite of papers on what we've just been discussing. A big thank you to Phil for joining us on the Oral Apothecary and for sharing his stories, his medicine for the formulary, his career anthem, and his book for the Oral Apothecary Library. As we mentioned, look, Phil will be joining us again as the mini-series continues. So we'll be back to you with some more planning as we invite some more guests on to explore. There's plenty more to explore around antimicrobials in such an important area. Look, Phil, I'll come back to you one last time. Just repeat that first sentence, or one of those first sentences you shared with us about the importance of the topic that we're talking about.
Yeah, antimicrobial resistance is becoming such an issue in some countries, and even to a degree in the UK, that it might stop us from doing transplantation, chemotherapy, and keeping young babies alive. We've got to all have an effort to try and improve our use of antibiotics by preventing infections. Get your jabs, hand hygiene, oral hygiene, no infections. Let's look after what we've got, and don't share them with your friends.
Very good. So thanks. So as well as our mini-series with the British Society for Antimicrobial Chemotherapy, we're planning Series 5 at the moment also, which is coming to you in January, we hope, a series focused on chatting to patients. If you'd like to input your ideas and suggestions for Series 5, then we'd love to hear from you. Thank you for your continued support. You can contact us via Twitter at Oral Apothecary. We're on LinkedIn. You can email us at oralapothecarypod@gmail.com. Gimmo now for the final ingredient.
Okay, so we talked today about antimicrobial resistance, but won't be so glad to hear that there's another similar related crisis looming on the horizon, and that's antifungal resistance. And so in October, the World Health Organization produced its first ever list of health-threatening fungi. Dr. Hannah Balke, who Assistant Director General of AMR, of antimicrobial resistance, says that emerging from the shadows of the bacterial antimicrobial resistance pandemic, fungal infections are growing and ever more resistant to treatments, becoming a public health concern worldwide. So fungal pathogens are a major threat to public health, and they're becoming increasingly common and resistant to treatment, with only 4 classes, they're saying, of antifungal medicines currently available and few candidates in the clinical pipeline. So I suppose a sense of deja vu there. Anyone want to hazard a guess at the fungi in the top 4?
Candida albicans.
It's in there, yeah.
Come on, James. Show us your clinician skills. Go on, you've been on the wards recently.
I didn't see any funguses.
Come on, Phil, finish it off for us.
There's probably Aspergillus fumigatus on there, I'm guessing.
Cryptococcus neoformans, Aspergillus fumigatus, Candida auris, is that pronounced right? And Candida albicans. So sorry, that wasn't such a light-hearted one this week. One more thing to add to the list to worry about is if we need another one. But it is a term that isn't so common, but may become more common, is antifungal stewardship. You heard it here first.
You have been listening to a 4 Apothecaries production. Sound engineer Jimbo Slough. Original music Jamie Brewster. Artwork by David Baker.
This episode of The Oral Apothecary is sponsored by onelesspill.com, a medicines optimization consultancy.
Thanks for listening to The Oral Apothecary. As ever, we dispensed with accuracy.